The temperature had dropped below freezing by the time Marcus Callaway's men reached the old timber surveyor's office. It sat alone on the eastern ridge above Silver Ridge, Colorado, a forgotten building that everyone assumed had been abandoned for years. The kind of place where records went to die quietly, where secrets could be buried under dust and rotting floorboards. Except tonight, those secrets had to burn. Jake Drummond led the group. He was Callaway's enforcer, the kind of man who'd broken enough bones and buried enough problems to stop questioning orders. Behind him came four others: P.D. Vance, who talked too much when he was nervous; Ray Tolbert, silent and mean; Carson Hughes, young and stupid enough to think this made him tough; and Gil Matson, who'd seen enough violence to know when something felt wrong. And tonight, everything felt wrong. "Supposed to be empty," P.D. muttered, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Right? Boss said nobody's been up here in months." "Shut up," Jake said without looking back. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip, not drawn, but ready. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the clearing, and the snow crunched loud under their boots. Too loud. In his experience, when you were trying to do something quiet, the world always seemed to get louder. They were 20 yards from the building when Gil stopped walking. "Jake." Something in his voice made the others pause. Gil wasn't the type to spook easy. He'd done dirty work for Callaway for nearly 3 years, and he'd never balked before. "What?" Jake turned, irritated. Gil pointed at the steps leading up to the office door. "Someone's there." At first, Jake didn't see it. The shadows were thick near the building, and the porch overhang blocked most of the moonlight. But then the figure shifted, barely, just enough, and Jake's stomach dropped. A man sat on the top step, leaning back against the doorframe like he was waiting for a train. His hat was pulled low, coat collar turned up against the cold. One leg stretched out, the other bent with his boot resting on a lower step. Relaxed, comfortable, like he'd been sitting there for hours, like he'd been expecting them. "The hell?" Carson whispered. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't right. Callaway had been clear. The office was empty. The records were unguarded. Get in, burn everything, get out. Simple, clean, no complications. But here was a complication, sitting calm as Sunday morning on those steps. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice harder than he felt. His hand closed around his pistol grip. The man didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the question, or maybe just deciding whether it was worth responding to. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, with the kind of Western drawl that came from spending more time with horses than people. "I'm the man you should have expected." That answer didn't help. Jake glanced at the others. Ray had already drawn his weapon. No surprise there. Petey looked like he wanted to run. Carson was trying to look tough, but failing. Gil just watched, his expression unreadable. "We got business here," Jake said. "Private business. You need to move along." "No." Just that. One word. No explanation, no threat, no bluster. Just a flat refusal. Jake felt his anger rising. He didn't like being told no, especially not by some lone drifter who probably didn't even know who he was dealing with. "You know who we work for?" "Marcus Callaway." The man said the name like he was reading it off a grocery list. "Owns the cooperative, controls the sheriff, runs this county like his personal kingdom." He paused. "Yeah, I know who you work for." That should have been the end of it. That should have been when the stranger backed down, realized he was outgunned and out of his depth. But instead, he just sat there, still as stone. "Then you know we don't ask twice," Jake said. He drew his pistol now, held it loose at his side. The others followed suit, 5 armed men against 1. The math was simple. The stranger's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You boys are in a bad spot." "We're in a bad spot?" Petey laughed, but it came out wrong. Too high, too nervous. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you, friend." "That's the problem." The stranger shifted his weight slightly, and for the first time, Jake noticed the gun belt. Not some cheap rig, but quality leather, worn smooth from use. The holster sat just right on his hip, not too high, not too low. The kind of setup a man only wore if he knew exactly how fast he could draw from it. Jake had seen men like this before. Not many, but enough. The kind who didn't talk much and didn't need to. The kind who'd already decided how things were going to go and were just waiting for everyone else to catch up. "We don't want trouble," Jake said, which was a lie, but sometimes lies bought you time to think. Too late for that. The stranger stood up, and the movement was unhurried, almost lazy. He wasn't tall, average height, average build. Nothing about him screamed dangerous, but the way he moved, the way he held himself, made Jake's instincts start screaming. Last chance, Jake said. Walk away. Can't do that. Why the hell not? Because I came here to make sure you boys don't burn that building, and I don't change my mind once it's made up. Ray laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You're going to stop all 5 of us? The stranger looked at Ray for a long moment, like he was memorizing his face. Won't need to stop all of you. Some of you are smarter than others. Screw this, Ray said, and raised his pistol. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds, but Jake would replay it in his mind for the rest of his life, trying to understand how it went so wrong so fast. The stranger's hand moved, not frantically, not desperately, but with a kind of fluid economy that suggested he'd done this exact motion 10,000 times. His pistol cleared leather before Ray's gun was even level, and the shot cracked across the mountain ridge like thunder. Ray went down hard, clutching his shoulder, his own gun falling into the snow. Carson panicked and fired, wild, high, nowhere close. The stranger had already moved, sidestepping like he'd known exactly where the shot was going before Carson pulled the trigger. His second shot took Carson in the leg, dropping him screaming to the ground. Petey didn't even get his gun up. He just froze, eyes wide, making a sound in his throat like a trapped animal. Jake tried to draw, tried to fire, tried to do something, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. His brain was still catching up to what his eyes had seen, 2 men down in less time than it took to draw breath. Gil hadn't moved. His gun was still holstered. He was the only one of them who seemed to understand what Jake was just beginning to grasp. They'd walked into a trap, but not the kind where you didn't see it coming, the kind where you saw it perfectly clear and walked in anyway because you thought you were tougher, smarter, luckier. They weren't. The stranger kept his pistol trained on Jake, but his eyes flicked to Gil. You look like you can count. Want to tell your friend here how this ends if he tries to finish his draw? Gil's voice was quiet. Jake, don't. Listen to him, the stranger said. He's the only one of you with sense. Jake's hand was still on his pistol grip, halfway out of the holster. His pride screamed at him to finish it, to take the shot, to prove he wasn't afraid. But his survival instinct was screaming louder. He let go of the gun. Smart, the stranger said. He looked at Petey, who still hadn't moved. You, drop it. Petey's pistol hit the snow before the sentence was finished. The stranger walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow, and kicked the fallen weapons away from Ray and Carson. Both men were still conscious, Ray cursing through gritted teeth, Carson sobbing. Non-fatal shots. Deliberate. Here's what happens now, the stranger said, looking at Jake. Your friends need a doctor. You're going to load them up and get them down the mountain. You're going to tell Callaway exactly what happened here. And you're going to tell him that if he wants these records, he'll have to come get them himself. Jake found his voice. He'll kill us for failing. Maybe. But I'll definitely kill you if you don't leave. Right now. There was no heat in the words, no anger, just certainty. Gil was already helping Carson up, supporting him as the younger man whimpered. Petey scrambled to help Ray, who was bleeding but mobile. Jake stood there, his mind still trying to process the impossible speed of what had just happened. Who are you? Jake asked again. The stranger considered this. Does it matter? I need to tell him something. Tell him the man he's been looking for found him first. The stranger gestured with his pistol toward the trail. Now get moving before I change my mind about those shots being non-fatal. They went, Gil and Petey half carrying Ray and Carson, Jake walking behind them, his legs feeling like water. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Jake looked back. The stranger had sat back down on the steps exactly as he'd been before. Watching. Waiting. Jake turned and kept walking. 20 minutes later, after they'd gotten the wounded men into the wagon they'd left at the base of the trail, Gil pulled Jake aside. We need to talk. Not now, Jake said. His hands were shaking, and he hated himself for it. Yeah, now. Gil's voice was hard. That man knew we were coming. He was waiting for us. Someone told him. Jake had already thought of that. Maybe he's just a drifter who picked a bad place to sleep. You believe that? No. He didn't. What are you saying? I'm saying Callaway's got a problem bigger than some burned records. I'm saying maybe we're on the wrong side of something that's already started moving. Gil glanced back up the mountain, where the office sat dark and silent. And I'm saying I don't plan to be here when it all comes down. You're running. I'm surviving. There's a difference. Gil started unhitching one of the horses. You should too. Callaway will find you. Maybe. But that man up there will definitely find you if you go back. Gil swung into the saddle. Your choice, Jake. Jake watched him ride off into the darkness. Part of him wanted to call out, to stop him, to argue. But the larger part, the part that had seen those two impossibly fast shots, knew Gil was right. He climbed onto the wagon with Petey and the wounded men and started down the mountain road toward Silver Ridge. Behind him, Carson was still crying. Ray had passed out from blood loss or shock or both, and Jake tried very hard not to think about what he was going to tell Marcus Callaway. The stranger waited until the sounds of the wagon had faded completely before he stood up again. He walked into the office, where 6 months' worth of carefully documented evidence sat in organized stacks on a desk that hadn't been dusty or forgotten at all. Purchase orders that didn't match delivery receipts. Loan documents with forged signatures. Property deeds transferred under suspicious circumstances. Tax records that showed money flowing in patterns that made no sense, unless you understood they were designed specifically not to make sense. Maria Reyes had done good work, dangerous work, the kind that got people killed if they weren't careful. The stranger lit the lantern on the desk and settled into the chair. From his coat pocket he pulled out a folded piece of paper, a map of Silver Ridge and the surrounding county. Red marks indicated key locations. Blue marks showed Callaway's holdings. Black marks were question marks, places where the influence wasn't clear. Almost the entire map was red or blue. The black marks were disappearing one by one. He'd studied this map for weeks, learning the geography of Callaway's power, every business he controlled, every official he'd bought, every family he'd pressured, every secret he'd buried. The stranger had learned long ago that power had a shape. It wasn't random. It had weak points, pressure points, places where the whole structure could collapse if you pushed in exactly the right spot. He'd spent 3 months finding those spots. Tonight was the beginning. Not the end. The beginning. He heard footsteps on the porch, lighter than before, careful. He didn't reach for his gun. You can come in, Maria. The door opened and Maria Reyes stepped inside. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, dressed in riding clothes that had seen better days. She looked at him, then at the maps and documents spread across the desk. They came, she said. It wasn't a question. 5 of them. Sent 2 to the doctor, sent 2 running. One's going back to tell Callaway. And you let him? I wanted him to. She nodded slowly, understanding. You want Callaway to know you're here. I want him to know it started. I want him making scared decisions instead of smart ones. The stranger folded the map. Fear makes people predictable. Maria moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. There's something you should know. Sheriff Tanner called a meeting tomorrow morning. Town council. Callaway will be there. Tanner finally growing a spine? Tanner's scared. He's been on Callaway's payroll for 2 years, but lately... She trailed off. Lately, I think he's realized it's all going to come out eventually. He's trying to figure out which side to land on. Doesn't matter which side he picks as long as he picks one. The stranger stood, stretching. What about Holt? Still keeping his head down, but he's ready. When the time comes, he'll talk. Thomas Holt, former accountant for Callaway's cooperative, the man who'd seen every number, every transaction, every dirty deal, and who'd finally grown enough of a conscience to let Maria copy the records before he resigned. He was living quietly on a small ranch outside town, waiting, afraid but waiting. And you? The stranger asked. You're sure about this? Maria turned from the window. I've been documenting Callaway's corruption for 18 months. I've watched him destroy families, ruin businesses, buy off every official who's supposed to protect people. I watched him order a man's barn burned because he wouldn't sell his land. I watched him bury evidence that would have sent 3 of his men to prison. Her jaw was tight. I'm sure. The stranger had met Maria 2 months ago in Denver, where she'd gone looking for someone, anyone, who could help her take down Callaway. She'd heard about a man who'd helped clean up a similar situation in Montana. A quiet man who didn't wear a badge, who didn't ask for payment, who just showed up when corruption got too thick and stayed until it was cut down. She'd found him tending bar in a nothing town, asked him for help, and expected him to say no. He'd said yes. Tomorrow, when Callaway hears what happened tonight, he's going to panic, the stranger said. Panicked men make mistakes. He'll either try to run or try to bury this harder. Either way, he'll expose himself. And if he runs, there's only one road through these mountains that isn't snowed in this time of year. The stranger tapped the map. He'll have to use it. You'll be waiting. I'll be waiting. Maria looked at him for a long moment. You know this might get you killed. Might? That doesn't bother you? The stranger considered the question. I've been in worse spots, and I've seen what happens when men like Callaway run towns like this. Seen it too many times. He met her eyes. Someone has to stand up eventually. Might as well be me. She wanted to ask him why. Why he did this. Why he put himself in danger for towns and people he didn't know. But she'd learned over the past 2 months that he didn't answer those questions. Maybe he didn't have an answer. Maybe he just didn't think it mattered. You should get back before someone notices you're gone, he said. What will you do? Stay here tonight. Make sure nobody tries again. Then tomorrow, after Callaway hears the news, I'll position myself where I need to be. He glanced at the stacks of documents. These are secure? Copies are already with my contact in Denver, federal prosecutor. If anything happens to the originals, she has backups. Smart. Maria moved toward the door, then paused. The man who ran, Gil Matson, he won't come back. But the others might tell Callaway where to find him. Let them. Gil made his choice. He gets to live with it. She left without another word, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lantern light. The stranger sat back down and continued studying the map. Every mark, every notation, every connection Maria had documented over 18 months of careful investigation. Callaway's empire wasn't built on violence alone. It was built on bureaucracy, on legal documents that looked legitimate but weren't, on shell companies and proxy owners, on debts that materialized out of nowhere and contracts that couldn't be broken. The kind of corruption that was almost impossible to fight because it hid behind the very systems designed to enforce justice. Almost impossible. But the stranger had learned something over the years. Every system had a breaking point. Every structure, no matter how carefully built, had a foundation. And if you could crack that foundation, really crack it, not just chip at it, the whole thing would come down. Callaway's foundation was fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing control. And tonight, for the first time in years, Callaway would be afraid. The stranger smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. He blew out the lantern and settled into the chair, his gun resting in his lap, and waited for morning. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, carrying snow across the ridge. The temperature dropped further. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of men below. But somewhere in Silver Ridge, 5 men were arriving at a doctor's office with bullet wounds and a story that would change everything. And somewhere else, in a fine house on the best street in town, Marcus Callaway was about to receive news that would make him understand, finally, that he'd made enemies he shouldn't have. The stranger closed his eyes and rested. Tomorrow, things would start moving fast. And when they did, there would be no stopping them. The doctor's office smelled like carbolic acid and old blood. Dr. Samuel Chen had been practicing medicine in Silver Ridge for 15 years, long enough to know when not to ask questions. Tonight was one of those times. Ray Tolbert lay on the examination table, his shirt cut away, shoulder packed with gauze that was already soaking through. Carson Hughes sat in the corner, leg bandaged, face pale as milk. The kid kept making these small gasping sounds, like he couldn't quite catch his breath. Bullet went clean through, Chen said, washing his hands in the basin. He didn't look at Jake Drummond, who stood near the door like he was planning his escape route. Ray's lucky. Another inch to the right and it would have hit the subclavian artery. He'd have bled out on that mountain. "You gonna be okay?" Petey Vance asked from where he sat on the floor back against the wall. His hands still shook. "If infection doesn't set in, keep the wound clean, change the dressing twice a day, and for the love of everything, keep him off whiskey for at least a week." Chen moved to Carson. "This one's going to be limping for a month, maybe 2. Bullet fractured the fibula. Could have been worse. Everything could have been worse. That was the problem. It should have been worse. They'd walked into a gunfight outnumbering the other man 5-1. By any reasonable calculation, they should have won. Instead, two of them were bleeding and the whole operation had gone straight to hell. Chen stepped back, drying his hands. I don't suppose you're going to tell me how this happened. Hunting accident, Jake said. In the middle of the night, in February. Chen's expression said he knew exactly how stupid that lie was. Right. Well, I'm legally obligated to report gunshot wounds to the sheriff, so… No need, Jake interrupted. We'll tell Tanner ourselves. I'm sure you will. Chen pulled a dark bottle from his cabinet. Laudanum, for the pain. Don't give them too much or they'll stop breathing. And Jake? He finally looked at Drummond directly. Whatever you boys are mixed up in, get out. I've patched up enough of Callaway's men over the years to know how these stories end. Jake didn't answer. He just gestured to Petey. Help me get them to the wagon. It took another 20 minutes to load Ray and Carson, get them settled with blankets against the cold, and point the horses toward the north end of town, where Callaway's main house sat on 3 acres of prime land, the kind of property that used to belong to a family named Morrison, until they defaulted on a loan they swore they'd never taken out. The house was dark except for one window on the second floor. Callaway's study. Jake had been in that room exactly 3 times in his life, and each time he'd left feeling smaller than when he'd entered. The man had a way of looking at you that made it clear you were furniture. Useful furniture, maybe, but furniture nonetheless. You want me to come in? Petey asked as they pulled up to the front gate. No, get these two somewhere warm and stay with them. I'll handle this. Jake, I know what he's gonna do. Jake climbed down from the wagon. Just go. He walked up the long gravel drive alone. The house loomed ahead, all dark wood and tall windows. The kind of place that was built to impress people and remind them who had money and who didn't. The front door was solid oak with brass fixtures that probably cost more than most people in Silver Ridge earned in a year. Jake knocked. The man who answered was Vincent Cross, Callaway's personal assistant and general fixer. He was thin, neat, dressed in a vest and shirt sleeves despite the late hour. His eyes took in Jake's appearance, the mud on his boots, the tension in his shoulders, and his expression didn't change at all. Mr. Drummond, it's quite late. Need to see Callaway. Mr. Callaway is not receiving visitors at this hour. He'll want to hear this. Cross studied him for another moment, then stepped aside. Wait in the front hall. The interior of the house was exactly what you'd expect. Expensive rugs, paintings in gilded frames, furniture that looked uncomfortable because it was designed to look impressive rather than functional. Jake stood in the center of the hall, feeling out of place, while Cross disappeared up the curved staircase. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jake had just started to wonder if Callaway was going to make him wait all night when he heard footsteps overhead. Marcus Callaway descended the stairs with the kind of measured pace that said he was never in a hurry because he expected the world to wait for him. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, clean-shaven, wearing a burgundy smoking jacket over pressed trousers. Everything about him was controlled, calculated, expensive. Jacob? Callaway's voice was smooth, educated. He'd grown up in Boston, moved west 20 years ago with money from a family shipping fortune, and had spent 2 decades turning that money into more money by any means necessary. Vincent tells me you have urgent news. I assume this means the task was completed successfully? Jake's throat felt dry. No, sir. Callaway stopped 3 steps from the bottom of the staircase. The change in his expression was subtle, just a slight tightening around the eyes. But Jake felt the temperature in the room drop. Explain. So Jake did. He kept it factual, tried not to make excuses, and laid out exactly what had happened on that mountain. The man on the steps, the impossible speed. Ray and Carson shot before they could react. Gil running, the warning message. When he finished, Callaway was quiet for a long time. He descended the last 3 steps, walked to a side table where a crystal decanter sat, and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He didn't offer Jake any. Let me see if I understand correctly, Callaway said, his back still to Jake. You took 4 men with you to handle a simple task. Burn some papers. Empty building, basic work. And instead you encountered one individual who managed to shoot 2 of your men, scare off a third, and send you back here with your tail between your legs and a message for me. He turned, glass in hand. Does that sum it up? Yes, sir. And this man, did you recognize him? No, sir. Never seen him before. What did he look like? Jake tried to remember details. It had been dark, and everything had happened so fast. Average height, maybe 35, 40 years old, dark coat, wide-brimmed hat. Nothing special about him except... He trailed off. Except what? The way he moved, the way he drew. I've seen fast men before, Mr. Callaway. This was different. It was like he knew what we were going to do before we did it. Callaway sipped his whiskey, thinking. And he specifically said to tell me that the man I've been looking for found me first. Yes, sir. Interesting. Callaway moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. I haven't been looking for anyone, which means either this person is confused or he knows something I don't. Neither option pleases me. He glanced back at Jake. Where's Gil Matson? Ran. Took a horse and headed out. Find him. I don't tolerate desertion. Mr. Callaway, with respect, I think we've got bigger problems than Gil running. Those records were supposed to be ash by now. Callaway's voice went cold. Instead, they're sitting in that office with some vigilante standing guard, and now he's made it personal by sending me a message. He drained his glass and set it down hard enough that Jake winced. I've spent 2 years building the cooperative into something significant. 2 years of careful planning, strategic acquisitions, calculated risks. I'm not going to let one man with delusions of heroism undo that work. What do you want me to do? Callaway was quiet again, but Jake could see him thinking, running through options, calculating angles. It was what made him dangerous, not physical strength or shooting skill, but this cold, relentless intelligence that could see 3 moves ahead. How many men can you gather by tomorrow night? Tomorrow night? Maybe 8, 10, if I pull from the logging operation. Do it. I want reliable men, not hotheads like Carson, people who can follow orders and won't panic if things get difficult. Callaway moved back to the decanter, poured another drink. And I want you to find out everything you can about this stranger. Where he's staying, who he's talked to, what he's doing in Silver Ridge. Someone must have seen him. Someone must know something. You think he's working with someone local? I think, Callaway said slowly, that those records didn't organize themselves. Someone's been collecting information on the cooperative's business dealings. Someone who knows what to look for and where to find it. This stranger didn't just wander onto that mountain by accident. He was positioned there because someone told him we'd be coming. Jake's stomach sank. He'd been so focused on the immediate problem, the man with the gun, that he hadn't thought about the larger implications. Someone inside Callaway's operation, or at least someone with access to information, was feeding intelligence to an outsider. You think it's Holt? Jake asked. Thomas Holt is a coward who ran away 6 months ago because he couldn't handle the moral complexity of real business. Callaway's tone was dismissive. But yes, he'd be my first suspect. He had access to the financial records. He knew how the cooperative operated, and he's been living quietly on that ranch of his, which suggests he's waiting for something. Want me to pay him a visit? Not yet. If we move against Holt too obviously, it might spook whoever else is involved. Right now, our priority is neutralizing this stranger and destroying those records. Everything else is secondary. Callaway looked at Jake directly. Can you handle this, or do I need to bring in outside help? The question was a challenge and a threat wrapped together. Outside help meant Jake had failed. It meant his position, his income, his status, possibly his life, was in jeopardy. I can handle it, Jake said. Then do so. Gather your men tomorrow. I want that office burned and that stranger dealt with by the end of the week. Callaway gestured toward the door. Now get out. I need to think. Jake left. He walked back down the gravel drive, climbed onto the wagon, and started the long ride to his own small house on the edge of town. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to accomplish what Callaway had ordered without ending up dead. The stranger had been too calm, too prepared. Men like that didn't make mistakes, didn't leave openings. And they definitely didn't sit alone on a mountain waiting for 5 armed men unless they had a very good reason to believe they'd win, which meant Jake needed more than just numbers. He needed an advantage. Information. Something. He was still thinking about it when he reached his house and found Sheriff Roy Tanner sitting on his porch. Tanner was a large man gone soft around the middle, with a thick mustache and tired eyes. He'd been sheriff for 6 years, the last 2 of which had been spent increasingly in Callaway's pocket. He looked up as Jake approached, and his expression was hard to read. "Little late for social calls, Sheriff," Jake said, climbing down from the wagon. "Not a social call." Tanner stood, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Got a report from Dr. Chen about 2 men with gunshot wounds." "Hunting accident," he said. "But Chen's been around long enough to know gunshot wounds when he sees them, and these didn't look like any hunting accident." "That right?" "That's right." Tanner stepped off the porch. "Want to tell me what really happened?" Jake considered his options. Tanner was on Callaway's payroll, but that didn't make him predictable. The sheriff still had a badge, still had some fragment of professional pride that occasionally surfaced at inconvenient times. "Private matter," Jake said finally. "Already discussed it with Mr. Callaway." "I'm sure you did. But the law says gunshot wounds get reported and investigated, private matter or not." "You planning to investigate?" Tanner was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to decide." That was interesting. That was very interesting. Jake had known Tanner for 3 years, and the man had never been uncertain about anything Callaway related before. He did what he was told, took his money, and looked the other way. But tonight, standing in the darkness outside Jake's house, he looked like a man who'd reached some kind of internal crossroads. "What's really going on, Jake?" Tanner asked quietly. "And don't give me another line about hunting. I know Callaway sent you boys somewhere tonight. I know something went wrong. And I know that when things go wrong around Callaway, bodies tend to pile up." Jake chose his words carefully. "There's a man in town, stranger. He interfered with cooperative business. Callaway wants him handled." "What kind of interference?" "The kind that involves a gun and 2 wounded men." Tanner absorbed this. "This stranger have a name?" "Not that I know." "Where's he staying?" "Don't know that either, but he was at the old surveyor's office up on the Eastern Ridge tonight. Might still be there." "And you're planning to go back with more men?" It wasn't a question. Jake didn't bother denying it. "Callaway's orders." "Right." Tanner looked away toward the mountains that were invisible in the darkness. "I'm calling a town council meeting tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Callaway's expected to attend." "What's the meeting about?" "Cooperative business. There's been questions, complaints. People want answers about some of the land acquisitions, some of the loan terms." Tanner met Jake's eyes. "Things are starting to come apart, Jake. Maybe you should think about where you want to be when they do." Before Jake could respond, Tanner walked to his horse, mounted up, and rode off into the night. Jake stood there for a long time, watching the space where the sheriff had been, trying to understand what had just happened. Tanner was wavering. Maybe worse than wavering. Maybe actively considering switching sides. And if Tanner was having doubts, how many others were too? Jake went inside, poured himself a drink he didn't really want, and tried to figure out how everything had gotten so complicated so fast. 24 hours ago, his biggest problem had been a boring night shift at the lumber mill. Now he was caught between a vengeful employer, a stranger who could shoot like something out of a dime novel, and a sheriff who seemed to be growing a conscience at the worst possible time. He drank, refilled his glass, and drank again. Tomorrow was going to be a very long day. Across town, in a small boarding house on Elm Street, the stranger who'd caused all this trouble was sleeping soundly in a rented room. His gun lay on the nightstand within easy reach. His boots were positioned for quick access, and his hat hung on a peg by the door. He'd arrived in Silver Ridge 3 days ago, paid for a week in advance, and had spent most of his time walking the streets, observing, learning the rhythm of the town. The landlady, Mrs. Patricia Gaines, had asked him his business, and he told her he was considering investment opportunities in the area. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was very interested in the opportunities that would open up once Callaway's empire collapsed. Mrs. Gaines had been happy to talk. People always were, once you showed genuine interest. She'd told him about the cooperative, about Callaway, about the way things had changed over the past 2 years. How families who'd owned land for generations suddenly found themselves in debt they couldn't pay. How businesses that had been profitable for decades were struggling. How everyone seemed afraid all the time, even if they couldn't quite articulate why. "Used to be a good town," she'd said, serving him coffee in her kitchen. "Quiet, friendly, people helped each other. Now everyone's looking over their shoulders, wondering when Callaway's going to come for them next." "Why don't they stand up to him?" the stranger had asked. "Who's going to lead them? The sheriff's bought, the mayor's scared. Most of the town council members either work for Callaway or owe him money. She'd shaken her head. It's like watching a slow poison work. You see what's happening, but you can't stop it. The stranger had thanked her for the coffee and the conversation, then gone back to his room to study his maps. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, he woke without alarm, checked his weapons, and dressed quietly. He had work to do before the sun came up. He left the boarding house through the back door, moved through alleys and side streets, and made his way to the eastern edge of town where Thomas Holt's ranch sat on 20 acres of decent grazing land. The house was small but well maintained. Holt lived alone since his wife had died 3 years back. No children, no close family. Just a middle-aged man who'd made some hard choices and was living with the consequences. The stranger knocked on the door just as the first gray light was touching the horizon. It took a minute, but eventually the door opened. Holt stood there in a nightshirt and trousers, holding a rifle that shook slightly in his hands. "Easy," the stranger said, hands visible and empty. "I'm a friend of Maria's." The rifle lowered a fraction. "You're the one she mentioned, the one who's helping." "That's right." Holt looked past him, scanning the yard for anyone else. "You shouldn't be here. If Callaway finds out..." "Callaway's got bigger problems than you right now. Can I come in?" Holt hesitated, then stepped back. The interior of the house was sparse but clean. A kitchen table, 2 chairs, a stove with a coffee pot already heating up. Holt set the rifle aside and gestured for the stranger to sit. "Maria said you'd be starting things," Holt said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Guess that was last night, based on the news I heard." "News travels fast. Dr. Chen's assistant is my cousin. She told me about the gunshot wounds. Said Jake Drummond looked like he'd seen a ghost." Holt sat across from the stranger, cupping his coffee like it might warm more than his hands. "You really take on 5 of Callaway's men by yourself? They made it easy. Came straight at me in the open, no cover, no plan." The stranger sipped his coffee. It was strong and bitter, the way it should be. "But that's not why I'm here. I need to know if you're still willing to testify." Holt's expression tightened. "Testify to what? Everything I know is in those documents Maria copied. Documents are evidence. Testimony is story. Jury needs both." The stranger leaned forward slightly. "You worked for Callaway for 3 years. You saw how he operated. You processed the fraudulent loans, the forged deeds, the shell company transfers. A prosecutor can wave papers at a jury all day, but it means more when someone who was actually there explains how it worked. I explain that, and Callaway will kill me." "Callaway is going to try to kill you anyway, soon as he realizes you're the leak." The stranger's voice was matter-of-fact. "Question is whether you die having done the right thing or die having stayed quiet." Holt laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's supposed to be encouraging?" "No, it's supposed to be honest." The stranger set down his cup. "Maria's already put the pieces in motion. Federal prosecutor in Denver has the documents. By the end of this week, warrants will be issued. Callaway's done, one way or another. But if you testify, it goes faster, cleaner, harder for him to wriggle out of it with expensive lawyers and political connections." "And if I don't?" "Then you sit here and hope he doesn't come for you before the law does for him." The stranger stood. "Your choice, but make it soon." He walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing. Town council meeting this morning at 10. Callaway will be there. Tanner's called it. Might be interesting." "Tanner?" Holt looked surprised. "Roy Tanner's actually standing up to Callaway?" "Maybe. Or maybe he's just trying to figure out which way the wind's blowing." The stranger opened the door. "Either way, things are starting to move. You should decide where you stand." He left Holt sitting at that kitchen table, staring into his coffee cup, wrestling with the same question men throughout history had wrestled with: whether doing the right thing was worth the cost. The stranger walked back toward town as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a clear day, cold but clear. By 9:30, word of the town council meeting had spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. The council usually met once a month in the afternoon, a boring affair that most people ignored. But an emergency meeting called by the sheriff, scheduled for mid-morning, with Callaway expected to attend, that was different. The meeting hall was a plain wooden building on Main Street that served triple duty as council chambers, community gathering space, and occasional church. By 9:45, it was already half full. Shopkeepers who'd closed for the hour, ranch hands with nothing better to do, housewives who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what was happening, and in the back row, wearing a dark coat and keeping his hat pulled low, sat the stranger. He watched the room fill up, studied the faces, noted who looked nervous and who looked curious. He saw Maria Reyes slip in and take a seat near the middle, her expression carefully neutral. He saw several men he recognized as Callaway's employees position themselves near the exits, not overtly threatening, but present. At 5 minutes to 10, Marcus Callaway entered through the side door, accompanied by Vincent Cross. He moved to the front row, sat down with the easy confidence of a man who expected to control the room, and waited. Sheriff Tanner came in last, looking like he hadn't slept. He stood at the front, shuffled some papers on the podium, and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he said. His voice was steady, but the stranger could see the tension in his shoulders. "I've called this meeting because there's been concerns raised about certain business practices within Silver Ridge, specifically regarding the Mountain Valley Cooperative." A murmur ran through the crowd. Callaway's expression didn't change, but Cross leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Tanner continued, "Over the past 6 months, my office has received complaints about aggressive lending practices, questionable foreclosures, and property transfers that don't seem to follow proper legal procedures. Now, I'll be honest. Until recently, I didn't give these complaints the attention they deserved." He paused. "That was wrong of me. So I'm here today to ask Mr. Callaway, as the head of the cooperative, to address these concerns publicly." Callaway stood slowly. He didn't look angry or worried. He looked like a patient teacher dealing with a slow student. "Sheriff Tanner, I appreciate your diligence, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. The cooperative operates according to all applicable laws and regulations. We have lawyers review every contract, every deed, every transaction. If there have been complaints, I suspect they come from people who made poor financial decisions and are now looking for someone else to blame." "That's not what I'm hearing," said a voice from the crowd. A man in the third row stood up, George Potter, who owned a hardware store. "My cousin lost his ranch last year because of a loan he swears he never signed for. The cooperative foreclosed in 3 months. 3 months. Even banks give you longer than that." "Your cousin," Callaway said smoothly, "signed a promissory note with very clear terms. If you didn't read them carefully, that's unfortunate, but it's not fraud. He says the signature isn't his." "Then he should have taken legal action instead of complaining to his relatives." Another voice, this time from the left side of the room. "What about the Morrison property? That family's been on that land for 30 years. Suddenly they're in debt and you own their house?" Callaway's expression hardened slightly. "The Morrisons defaulted on a loan they took out to expand their cattle operation. The loan was legitimate, the default was verified, and the foreclosure followed proper legal procedures. This is business, not charity." The stranger watched the room carefully. People were getting agitated. Callaway was technically correct in his responses, but he was also making it very clear that he didn't care about the human cost of his business practices, and that was creating resentment. Maria Reyes stood up. "Mr. Callaway, I've been reviewing property records for a newspaper article I'm writing. I found at least 15 cases in the past 2 years where families lost property to the cooperative under questionable circumstances. In each case, the loan terms were extraordinarily harsh, the foreclosure was unusually fast, and the property ended up under cooperative control at well below market value. That seems like a pattern." "What newspaper?" Callaway asked. "The Silver Ridge Herald folded 8 months ago. I'm freelancing for the Denver Post." That got attention. The Denver Post was real, had reach, could cause actual problems. The stranger saw Callaway's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "Miss Reyes, I'd be careful about publishing allegations you can't prove. Libel laws exist for a reason." "I'm not alleging anything. I'm reporting documented facts." Maria held up a folder. "I have copies of all the relevant documents. They're a matter of public record." "Then I'm sure your editor will review them carefully before printing anything." Callaway turned back to Tanner. "Sheriff, unless there's actual evidence of wrongdoing, not speculation, not complaints from people unhappy with their own choices, but actual evidence, then I don't see what purpose this meeting serves." Tanner looked like he was fighting with something internally. The stranger could see it. The moment where the sheriff had to decide whether to push or fold. And in that moment, watching Tanner's face, the stranger knew which way it would go. Tanner wasn't ready. Not yet. I appreciate your time, Mr. Callaway, Tanner said finally. I'll continue reviewing the complaints and will let you know if further action is needed. It was a retreat. Not complete, but definite. Callaway had won this round. The meeting dispersed slowly. People filed out, some looking disappointed, others relieved, most just confused. Callaway left through the side door without speaking to anyone. Maria stayed in her seat, staring at the folder in her hands. The stranger waited until most of the crowd had cleared, then approached her. You pushed hard, he said quietly. Not hard enough. She looked up at him, frustrated. I thought Tanner would actually do something. He's scared. Men like him don't change overnight. The stranger glanced toward the door where Callaway had exited. But you got under his skin. Mentioning the Denver Post showing you have documentation, that worried him. Worried isn't stopped. No, but worried men make mistakes, and Callaway's about to make several. The stranger tipped his hat. Stay visible today. Stay around people. Don't go anywhere alone. Why? What's going to happen? Callaway's running out of time and he knows it. He'll try something drastic soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon. The stranger started toward the exit. And when he does, that's when we finish this. He left her there and walked out into the midday sun. The wheels were turning now, momentum building. Callaway would hear about the town hall meeting, about Maria's public challenge, about the documents she claimed to have. Combined with last night's failure at the surveyor's office, it would push him toward a decision, run or fight. The stranger was betting on fight. Men like Callaway didn't run until they'd exhausted every other option. They'd spent too long being in control, too long being feared. The idea of fleeing from some nobody with a gun and a journalist with a folder, it would offend their sense of self. So Callaway would gather his forces, make a plan, and try to crush the problem with overwhelming force. It's what powerful men always did when they felt threatened. And when he did, the stranger would be waiting. Because the thing about overwhelming force was that it required coordination, logistics, movement, all things that could be predicted, anticipated, exploited. The stranger walked through Silver Ridge one more time, noting the locations that mattered. The sheriff's office, the telegraph station, the road north out of town, the mountain pass. Everything was geometry. Angles, distances, timing. You just had to see the shape of it. By evening, Jake had gathered 11 men, not the 8 or 10 he'd hoped for, but enough. They met in the warehouse behind the lumber mill, where Callaway sometimes conducted business that needed to stay out of public view. The men were a mixed group. Some were regular cooperative employees who followed orders. Others were drifters who'd been hired for muscle and didn't ask questions. A few were locals who owed Callaway money and were working it off. Jake looked at them and felt something close to despair. These weren't soldiers. They weren't even particularly competent thugs. They were just men who'd ended up on the wrong side of things and didn't know how to get back. Here's the situation, Jake said, standing in front of a rough map he'd drawn on the warehouse wall. There's a man causing problems for the cooperative. He's holed up at the old surveyor's office on the Eastern Ridge. Mr. Callaway wants him removed and the building burned. We go up there tonight. We finish the job. How many men he got with him? Asked one of the drifters, a scarred man named Dutch. Last night it was just him. Just him? Dutch laughed. And he sent you boys running? Jake's face hardened. He got lucky, caught us by surprise. Tonight we won't be surprised. What's the approach? This from Pete Logan, who'd done some actual military service and at least knew how to think tactically. We split into 3 groups. One comes from the front, one from each side. We surround the building, give him no way out, and end it. Jake looked around the room. Questions? There were none, though the stranger could have told them that was because most of these men weren't smart enough to know what questions to ask. We leave at midnight, Jake said. Dress warm, bring weapons, and for the sake of everything, follow my orders. Don't go running off, don't try to be a hero, and don't underestimate this man. Clear? They dispersed. Jake stayed behind, staring at his crude map, trying to convince himself this would work. The door opened and Vincent Cross entered, moving with his usual precise economy of motion. Mr. Callaway asked me to deliver a message, Cross said. If this operation fails, he's leaving Silver Ridge tonight, and he expects you to ensure he has safe passage. Jake turned. Leaving? What about the cooperative, the property? Will be handled by lawyers and proxies. Mr. Callaway is a pragmatist. If this situation cannot be contained locally, he'll contain it from a distance. Cross adjusted his cuffs. You understand what that means for you, yes? Jake understood perfectly. If Callaway ran, he'd cut all ties to Silver Ridge, including the people who knew too much. And Jake knew everything. I'll make sure he gets out, Jake said. See that you do. Cross left as quietly as he'd arrived. Jake stood alone in the warehouse, the weight of multiple impossible tasks pressing down on him. Stop the stranger, burn the evidence, protect Callaway, survive. Pick any three, he thought bitterly, because you're not getting all four. At 11:30 that night, 11 men on horseback rode out of Silver Ridge toward the eastern ridge. The moon was bright, the air was cold, and every man was thinking about money or fear or both. None of them were thinking about geometry. That was going to be a problem. The surveyor's office was empty when Jake and his men arrived. Not abandoned empty, but deliberately empty, like someone had packed up and left hours ago. The door hung open, the lantern was cold, and on the desk where stacks of incriminating documents should have been, there was only a single piece of paper weighted down with a rock. Jake picked it up, angled it toward the moonlight streaming through the window, and read the neat handwriting. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong move. Son of a... He crumpled the paper. Searched the building, everything. He might have hidden them. The men spread out, tearing through the small office with increasing desperation. They found nothing. No records, no ledgers, no evidence. Just dust and empty shelves and the mocking silence of a building that had served its purpose and been discarded. Pete Logan emerged from the back room shaking his head. Nothing. It's clean. He knew we were coming, Dutch said, leaning against the door frame. Had to. Probably been gone since this afternoon. Jake wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The stranger had outthought them again, stayed 2 steps ahead, turned their assault into a waste of time and energy. 11 men riding up a mountain in the middle of the night to find exactly nothing. So what now? Pete asked. Jake looked at the empty desk, the open door, the darkness beyond. His mind was racing through possibilities, trying to salvage something from this disaster. If the stranger had moved the documents, where would he take them? Who would he trust with them? The answer came to him with sickening clarity. Holt, Jake said. Thomas Holt. He lives alone, isolated, and he used to work for the cooperative. Stranger probably moved everything there. You sure? Dutch didn't sound convinced. You got a better idea? Jake was already moving toward the door. Come on. If I'm right, we can still finish this tonight. They rode hard toward Holt's ranch, the horses laboring in the cold night air. Jake kept replaying Callaway's words in his head. If this fails, he's leaving. And if Callaway left, Jake was a loose end. Men like Marcus Callaway didn't leave loose ends walking around. The ranch appeared ahead, a small house with a barn and a few fenced acres. Lamplight showed in one window. Someone was home. Jake raised his hand, stopping the group about 50 yards out. Pete, take 3 men around the back. Dutch, you and 2 others cover the barn. Rest with me. If he runs, we have him boxed. They dismounted and moved into position as quietly as 11 cold, nervous men could manage. Jake waited until he saw Pete's signal from the rear of the house, then walked up to the front door and knocked hard. Holt, open up! Silence. Then footsteps inside, hesitant and slow. I've got nothing to say to you, Jake. Holt's voice came through the door, strained. Not here to talk. Open the door or we'll break it down. More silence. Jake was about to signal his men to force entry when the door swung open. Holt stood there in his nightclothes, holding that same rifle he'd had earlier, still shaking. Where is he? Jake demanded. Where's who? Don't play stupid. The stranger. The one who's been causing all this trouble. We know he was here this morning. Holt's face went carefully blank, but not quite fast enough. Jake saw the flicker of recognition, the moment of calculation. I don't know what you're talking about. Jake pushed past him into the house. The other men followed, spreading through the rooms, opening cabinets, tearing apart anything that might hide papers. Holt stood frozen in his own entryway, the rifle hanging uselessly in his hands. They searched for 20 minutes. The house wasn't large. It didn't take long to confirm what Jake already suspected halfway through. Nothing. Again. He's not here, Pete reported. No sign of him. No sign of documents. Nothing. Jake turned to Holt, frustration boiling over into something uglier. Where did he take them? I told you, I don't... Jake grabbed Holt by his nightshirt, shoved him against the wall hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I'm done with games. Callaway's done with games. You know something, and you're going to tell me right now. Holt's eyes widened, genuine fear replacing the careful blankness. Jake, I swear. I don't know where he is. He came by this morning, asked me some questions, and left. That's all. What kind of questions? About testifying. About whether I'd be willing to speak to a prosecutor. Holt was breathing fast now, panic setting in. I didn't give him an answer. He left, and I haven't seen him since. Jake released him, stepped back. His mind was working through the implications. If the stranger was talking about prosecutors and testimony, that meant the legal machinery was already in motion. Documents weren't just evidence anymore. They were part of an active case, which meant they were probably already in Denver, out of reach. We're wasting time here, Dutch said from the doorway. If the papers are gone, they're gone. We should get back, tell Callaway, and figure out what's next. Jake knew he was right, but admitting defeat twice in one night was more than he could stomach. He looked at Holt, saw the fear and guilt written all over the man's face, and made a decision that would haunt him later. Bring him. What? Holt's voice cracked. You're coming with us. If you won't talk now, maybe you'll talk when Callaway asks the questions. Jake nodded to two of his men. Tie him up, put him on a horse. This is kidnapping, Holt said desperately. Jake, you can't. I can, and I am. You should have thought about consequences before you started helping that stranger. Jake walked out, leaving his men to handle the details. They bound Holt's hands, threw a coat over his shoulders, and hoisted him onto one of the spare horses. The whole thing took 5 minutes, efficient and brutal, and when they rode away from the ranch, Holt was among them, silent and terrified. They were halfway back to Silver Ridge when the stranger stepped into the road ahead of them. He didn't appear dramatically or suddenly. He was just there, standing in the middle of the narrow mountain path like he'd been waiting hours. The moonlight caught the edge of his hat brim and the gleam of metal at his hip. The led horses shied, and the whole group came to a confused, bunching halt. Evening, gentlemen, the stranger said. His voice carried in the cold air, conversational and calm. That's far enough. Jake's hand went to his pistol, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Not after what he'd seen this man do. You're making a mistake. I've made plenty. This isn't one of them. The stranger's eyes moved across the group, counting, assessing. You boys are in violation of several laws right now. Kidnapping's a federal offense. So's conspiracy. You might want to think about that. We're taking Holt to answer some questions, Jake said. That's all. No. You're not. The stranger took a step forward and several of the horses stamped nervously. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to cut him loose, put him back on his horse, and let him ride home. Then you're all going to turn around and head back to town. Dutch laughed, but it sounded forced. There's 11 of us and 1 of you. Again. How'd that work out last time? Oh, right, we weren't there. But Jake was, and he told us all about it. Did he tell you I let him live on purpose? Did he tell you I could have shot him just as easy as the others, but I chose not to? The stranger's gaze fixed on Jake. I gave you a chance to walk away from this. You should have taken it. Pete Logan had been quiet until now, studying the situation with his military experience. You can't cover all of us. Even if you're fast, even if you get 2 or 3, the rest will get you. Mathematics doesn't lie. You're right, the stranger said. Mathematics doesn't, but you're calculating wrong. How's that? You're assuming I came alone. The shot came from the hillside to their left, not aimed at anyone, just a rifle crack that echoed across the rocks. The horses panicked, several rearing, and the whole group scattered in confusion. A second shot, this time from the right side. Then a third from somewhere behind them. Jake fought to control his horse, his head spinning. Multiple shooters? How many? Where? Next shots won't be warnings, the stranger called out over the chaos. Drop your weapons, now. Don't, Jake started to say, but he never finished because Pete Logan was already dismounting, unbuckling his gun belt, letting it fall to the ground. Not worth dying for, Jake, Pete said quietly. Whatever Callaway's paying us, it's not worth dying for. One by one, the others followed. Dutch cursed but complied. The drifters and hired men dropped their weapons without hesitation. They hadn't signed up for a war, just for easy money. Within 2 minutes, 11 men were disarmed. The stranger walked forward, collecting pistols, rifles, knives. He worked methodically, never turning his back on the group, always maintaining distance. "Cut Holt loose," he said to Jake. Jake did, his fingers fumbling with the ropes. Holt slid off the horse, rubbing his wrists, looking between Jake and the stranger like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Go home, Thomas," the stranger said. "And tomorrow, you talk to that prosecutor. Tell her everything." Holt nodded shakily and took one of the horses, riding off into the darkness without looking back. The stranger watched him go, then turned his attention back to the disarmed men. "Here's what I want you to understand. What you just experienced, the multiple shooters, the coordinated fire, that was theater. There's no one else on these hills, just me. I fired all 3 shots." He let that sink in. Let them realize they'd been bluffed with nothing more than echo and timing. "I could have killed half of you before you knew what was happening," the stranger continued. "I didn't, because most of you are just scared men making bad choices. But if I see any of you working for Callaway after tonight, if I see you making those same bad choices again, I won't be generous twice." He stepped back, gestured down the mountain path. "Go, and tell Callaway his time in Silver Ridge is over. Tell him if he runs now, he might make it somewhere safe. But if he stays, if he tries to keep fighting this, it ends badly for him." Jake wanted to say something defiant, something to salvage his pride. But the words wouldn't come. He just gathered his reins, nodded to the others, and started riding. They left their weapons on the ground. No one looked back. When they were gone, the stranger collected the guns, disabled them by removing firing pins and ejecting ammunition, and scattered the pieces across the hillside where they'd be hard to find in the dark. Then he sat on a flat rock and waited for dawn. Maria Reyes found him there an hour later, riding up from the opposite direction. "I heard shots," she said, dismounting. "Warning shots. It's handled." "Holt? On his way home. He'll testify." The stranger stood, stretched muscles that were getting stiff from the cold. "How's the situation in town?" "Tense. People are talking about the council meeting, about what I said. Some are angry at Callaway, some are defending him, most are just confused." She paused. "Sheriff Tanner came by my boarding house this evening, asked if I really had documents, if I really was working with the Denver Post." "What'd you tell him?" "The truth, that I have copies of everything and that federal prosecutors are already reviewing the case." She looked at the stranger directly. "He asked if there was a way to make this right, said he'd made mistakes but wanted to fix them." "What'd you say to that?" "I said it wasn't my forgiveness he needed, that he should talk to all the people whose complaints he ignored, whose cases he buried, whose lives got ruined while he looked the other way." Maria's voice was hard. He didn't like that answer. "Probably not, but it's the right one." The stranger started walking toward where he'd hidden his horse. "Callaway's going to run, probably tonight, tomorrow at the latest. He knows the walls are closing in. And you're going to stop him." It wasn't a question. The stranger nodded. "There's only one road out of these mountains this time of year that's passable with a wagon," he said. "Northern Pass follows the river valley. It's narrow, steep in places, and there's a spot about 10 miles from town where it bottlenecks between 2 rock faces. You're going to ambush him. I'm going to give him a choice, surrender or fight. What he picks is up to him." Maria was quiet for a moment, processing. "And if he fights? Then it ends there." The stranger's voice was matter-of-fact. "One way or another." She wanted to argue, to say there had to be another way, that the law should handle this. But she'd seen what the law did in Silver Ridge, or rather, what it didn't do. She'd watched corruption fester for 2 years while Sheriff Tanner cashed Callaway's checks and looked the other way. Sometimes the law needed help. Sometimes it needed someone willing to stand in the road and say no further. "Be careful," she said finally. "Always am." She rode back toward town, and the stranger made his way to the northern pass to study the terrain in daylight, to find the exact right position, to calculate angles and distances and timing. Geometry. Always geometry. Back in Silver Ridge, Jake Drummond stood in Marcus Callaway's study and delivered his report. He left nothing out: the empty office, the failed search of Holt's ranch, the stranger on the road, the humiliating disarmament. Callaway listened without interrupting, his face carved from stone, his fingers steepled in front of him. When Jake finished, the silence stretched for so long that Jake started to wonder if he should say something else. Finally, Callaway spoke. Do you know what the most valuable thing in business is, Jacob? Jake didn't answer. It felt like a rhetorical question. Information, Callaway continued, knowing what others don't, understanding situations before they develop, anticipating problems before they become crises. He stood, walked to his desk, opened a drawer. I've built everything I have on superior information, on knowing more than my competitors, more than my enemies, more than the authorities. He pulled out a leather folder, thick with papers. But in this case, I was the one who didn't know. Didn't know Thomas Holt was copying records. Didn't know Maria Reyes was investigating the cooperative. Didn't know some stranger was going to walk into my town and start dismantling everything I'd built. He set the folder on the desk with a heavy thud. That's unacceptable. Mr. Callaway, we can still— No, we can't. Callaway's voice was flat. It's over, Jake. The federal prosecutors have the documents. They'll issue warrants. Even if I fight the charges, the legal battle will drag on for years and cost a fortune. My reputation is destroyed. The cooperative's finished. It's done. Jake felt something like relief, which immediately turned to fear because if Callaway was giving up, what did that mean for the people who'd worked for him? Callaway seemed to read his mind. I'm leaving tonight. There's a wagon being prepared now with essential items. I'll take the Northern Pass, be in Wyoming by tomorrow evening, and from there I can disappear until this situation resolves itself. He looked at Jake. You're coming with me. Sir, you know too much to stay here, and I need someone I can trust to help with logistics, security, the practicalities of starting over. Callaway opened the folder, began sorting through papers. You'll be well compensated, more than you're making now. Jake's mind raced. Leave Silver Ridge, leave Colorado, become a fugitive, helping a fugitive. The alternative was staying and facing whatever came next. Prosecution as an accessory, or worse, revenge from the people Callaway had hurt over the years. Not much of a choice. When do we leave? Jake asked. 2 hours. The wagon will be ready, supplies loaded, route planned. We'll travel through the night, stay off main roads, move quickly. Callaway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. One advantage of spending 2 years preparing for every contingency? I planned for this one too. Jake nodded and left to gather his things. He went home, threw clothes and essentials into a bag, stood in his small house for a long moment, looking at the life he was about to leave behind. It wasn't much of a life, but it had been his. He locked the door and walked toward Callaway's property as the clock struck midnight. The wagon was ready as promised, a sturdy freight wagon with a covered bed pulled by 4 strong horses. Vincent Cross was already seated in the driver's position, reins in hand, looking as calm and composed as ever. Callaway emerged from the house carrying a small trunk, which Jake helped load into the back. That's everything? Jake asked. Everything that matters. Callaway climbed into the wagon beside Cross. Financial documents, property deeds, enough cash to start over. The rest can be replaced. They pulled away from the house without ceremony, following back streets toward the northern road. Silver Ridge was dark and quiet, most people asleep, unaware that the man who'd controlled their town for 2 years was leaving in the middle of the night. They reached the edge of town and turned onto the mountain road that would take them through the pass and beyond. The wagon rolled smoothly despite the rough terrain, the horses sure-footed and strong. Jake rode beside the wagon on his own horse, alert for trouble but not really expecting any. If the stranger knew Callaway was running, he'd be back at that office or watching Holt's ranch or coordinating with Maria Reyes. He wouldn't know about this midnight escape until it was too late. They traveled for 2 hours, climbing gradually into the mountains. The road narrowed as they went, hemmed in by rock walls and steep drops. Cross handled the wagon with practiced skill, navigating the turns and grades without complaint. Jake started to relax. They were going to make it. Another few hours and they'd be through the pass, into open territory, gone. Then they came around a bend and saw him. The stranger stood in the middle of the road at the narrowest point, where the pass squeezed between 2 high rock faces. There was no room to go around him, no way to turn the wagon, just a straight line of road with a man blocking it. Cross pulled the horses to a halt. The wagon stopped 30 feet from where the stranger stood. "Evening," the stranger said, his voice carrying in the mountain silence. Callaway leaned forward, studying the man who'd destroyed his empire. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." "One of my few virtues." The stranger walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty. But we're past the point where this ends peacefully, Mr. Callaway. You know that. What I know, Callaway said, is that you've been interfering in my business without authority, without jurisdiction, and without any legal standing. You're a vigilante at best, a criminal at worst. Maybe, but I'm a criminal who's standing between you and freedom, and that seems to be the relevant fact right now. Jake's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped when he remembered he didn't have one. The stranger had taken it hours ago. All the weapons were back on that hillside, scattered and disabled. Vincent, Callaway said quietly, do you have your pistol? Yes, sir. Then use it. Cross drew smoothly, raised the gun, aimed at the stranger's chest. His hand was steady, his expression unchanged. Last chance to move, he said. The stranger didn't move. Cross fired. The shot echoed between the rock walls, impossibly loud in the confined space. For a fraction of a second, Jake thought it was over, thought the stranger had finally miscalculated, thought the stranger was gone. Not wounded, not falling, just gone, like he'd never been there at all. Jake's mind couldn't process it. No one was that fast. No one could dodge a bullet at that range. Then he understood. The stranger had never been standing where they'd seen him. It had been positioning, angles, shadows, moonlight. He'd been standing 3 feet to the left, and they'd been looking at empty space. Cross understood it too, a heartbeat too late. He swung the gun left, trying to acquire the real target, but the stranger was already moving. The stranger's shot came from the darkness beside the road, not aimed at Cross or Callaway or even the horses. It was aimed at the wagon wheel, the front right wheel specifically. The wheel exploded, wood and iron fragments scattered, and the wagon lurched violently to the side. The horses screamed and tried to bolt, but Cross held them with iron control. The wagon didn't flip, but it was crippled, listing heavily to the damaged side. Cross fired twice more into the darkness, but the stranger had moved again. Jake heard boots on rock, impossibly quick, impossibly sure. Another shot from the stranger. The second front wheel shattered. The wagon dropped hard, the axle scraping rock. Cross fought the reins, but there was nothing to fight. The horses couldn't pull a wagon with no front wheels. They were stuck. Callaway sat frozen, his face pale in the moonlight. Jake saw the moment when the man realized it was over, truly over. No escape, no plan, just a broken wagon in a mountain pass with a man who wouldn't let them through. Get out of the wagon, the stranger's voice came from somewhere in the rocks above them. Keep your hands where I can see them. Callaway and Cross climbed down carefully. Jake dismounted, standing beside them in the middle of the road. The stranger emerged from the darkness, his gun drawn and ready. He looked at the three of them, then at the disabled wagon. I told you how this would end, he said to Callaway. I told you to surrender or run. You chose run. Didn't work out. So what now? Callaway's voice was tight with controlled rage. You shoot us? Execute us in cold blood? No. Now we wait for the law to arrive. The stranger glanced up at the sky, judging the time. Sheriff Tanner should be here within the hour. I sent him a message about where you'd be. Tanner works for me. Used to. People change their minds when they realize which side of history they're on. The stranger gestured with his gun. Sit down, all of you. Hands on your heads. They sat. It was the most humiliating moment of Jake's life. Sitting in the dirt with his hands on his head like a child in trouble, watching everything fall apart. Cross spoke for the first time, his voice calm despite the situation. You can't hold us here. Eventually we'll find an opening. Maybe. But I don't think you're going to try. The stranger sat on a rock facing them, gun resting across his knees. Because you're smart men, and smart men know when they're beaten. Mr. Callaway here spent 2 years building an empire on information and calculation. He understands odds. Right now, the odds of you three overpowering me before I put bullets in at least 2 of you are effectively 0. Callaway said nothing, but his silence was confirmation. They waited. The temperature dropped. The wind picked up, carrying snow from higher elevations. Jake started shivering and couldn't stop. 45 minutes later, they heard horses approaching from the direction of Silver Ridge. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Sheriff Roy Tanner appeared first, riding beside Maria Reyes. Behind them came 3 deputized townsmen, carrying rifles and looking nervous. Tanner dismounted, looked at the scene, the broken wagon, the 3 men sitting in the dirt, the stranger keeping watch, and something in his expression changed, like he'd been carrying a weight for 2 years and had finally set it down. "Marcus Callaway," Tanner said formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, forgery, and conspiracy. There's federal warrants waiting in Denver, but I figure we'll start with the local charges first." Callaway stood slowly, brushing dirt from his expensive trousers. "This is a farce, Roy. You know it, and I know it. Those charges won't stick. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but you'll be in custody while we find out." Tanner gestured to his deputies. "Bind them, all 3. The deputies moved forward with rope. Jake didn't resist. Neither did Cross. Callaway stood rigid as they tied his hands, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," Callaway said to Tanner. "I made you. One word from me and your career is over." "My career was over the day I took your first bribe," Tanner said quietly. "I'm just trying to salvage what's left of my conscience." They loaded Callaway, Cross, and Jake onto horses and started the long ride back to Silver Ridge. The stranger helped Maria examine the wagon, pulling out Callaway's trunk and the documents inside. "Evidence," Maria said, flipping through papers in the moonlight. "More than enough to support the charges." The stranger nodded. He felt tired suddenly, bone-deep tired, the kind that came from too many nights without sleep and too much adrenaline finally wearing off. "It's done," he said. "The beginning is done. The rest, the trials, the restitution, rebuilding trust, that'll take years. That's not my part." The stranger looked toward Silver Ridge, hidden in the darkness below. "My part's finished." Maria turned to him. "You're leaving. Soon. Few more days. Make sure everything's stable. Then, yeah. Where will you go?" "Wherever the next place needs someone to stand in the road." He smiled faintly. "There's always a next place." They rode back together in silence, leading the horses that carried Callaway and his associates toward justice. The eastern sky was starting to lighten with the first hint of dawn. By the time they reached Silver Ridge, the whole town was awake. Word had spread somehow. Maybe someone had seen the sheriff leave with deputies. Maybe Maria had told someone before she left. However it happened, people lined the main street, watching in silence as Callaway was led to the jail in handcuffs. Some looked satisfied. Some looked shocked. Most just looked tired. The stranger didn't join the crowd. He returned to his boarding house, went to his room, and slept for 12 hours straight. When he woke, the sun was setting again. A whole day had passed. He washed, dressed, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Gaines cooking dinner. "You're famous," she said, not looking up from her stove. "Everyone's talking about what happened. How you stopped Callaway, helped the sheriff find his spine, saved the town." "I didn't save anything. Just removed an obstacle. Call it what you want. People are grateful." She paused. "There's talk of throwing you a celebration. Parade, maybe. Speech from the mayor?" The stranger felt something close to panic. "No celebrations." "Thought you might say that." She ladled soup into a bowl, handed it to him. "There's also talk that you're leaving soon as things settle. They'll miss you, the ones who know what you did. They'll get over it." He ate the soup, which was good and hot and exactly what he needed. "Town doesn't need me. It needs to learn how to stand up for itself." Mrs. Gaines sat across from him. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why do you do this? Travel around, help strangers, put yourself in danger. You don't get paid, you don't get thanks most of the time, so why?" The stranger considered the question. It was one he'd been asked before, in other towns, by other grateful people who couldn't understand why someone would risk themselves for nothing. "I knew a town once," he said finally. "Good town, good people. Corrupt sheriff, corrupt mayor, corrupt everything. No one stood up because everyone was scared, and the rot just got worse and worse until there wasn't anything good left." He looked at her directly. "I was one of the scared people, one of the ones who stayed quiet, and I've spent a lot of years trying to make up for that." Mrs. Gaines nodded slowly, understanding. "You can't save that town. It's gone." "I know, but I can save other ones." He finished his soup, or at least try. She didn't say anything else, just took his bowl and went back to her cooking. The stranger sat there for a while longer, watching the sun set through the window, thinking about the past and the future and the thin line between them. Tomorrow, he'd check on Holt, make sure the man was safe. He'd talk to Maria, confirm the federal prosecutors had everything they needed. He'd speak with Tanner, ensure the sheriff understood what came next. And then, maybe 2 or 3 days from now, he'd pack his things, settle his bill with Mrs. Gaines, and ride out of Silver Ridge the same way he'd ridden in, quietly, without fanfare, already thinking about the next place. Because there was always a next place, always another town where power had corrupted into something ugly, always another fight worth having. He stood, thanked Mrs. Gaines for the soup, and went back upstairs to his room. Through the window, he could see Main Street where people were going about their evening business. The tension that had hung over the town for 2 years was starting to lift. Not gone, that would take time, but lifting. It was enough. It would have to be enough. The stranger settled into his chair, pulled out his maps, and began planning his next move. The morning after Callaway's arrest, Silver Ridge woke to something it hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty that felt like possibility instead of threat. The jail held 3 men who'd terrorized the town through legal manipulation and fear, and for the first time, people started asking questions out loud instead of whispering them behind closed doors. Sheriff Roy Tanner arrived at his office before dawn, unable to sleep, and found a crowd already gathering outside. Not an angry mob, nothing like that. Just people who wanted to see with their own eyes that Marcus Callaway was really behind bars. Inside the jail, Callaway sat on the narrow cot in his cell, looking smaller somehow without his expensive suits and confident bearing. Vincent Cross occupied the cell beside him, silent and composed as always. Jake Drummond was in the 3rd cell, staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had gone so wrong so fast. Tanner poured himself coffee, looked at his prisoners, and felt the weight of 2 years' worth of corruption pressing down on his shoulders. He'd let this happen. Worse, he'd helped it happen. Every complaint he'd buried, every investigation he'd derailed, every blind eye he'd turned had contributed to the suffering these men had caused. The door opened and Maria Reyes entered, carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. "Morning, Sheriff," she said. Her eyes were bright with purpose despite the early hour. "I've compiled everything for the federal prosecutors. Financial records, property transfers, testimonies from victims, the whole case." Tanner gestured to his desk. "Put it here. They're sending someone from Denver this afternoon to collect everything and coordinate the transfer." Transfer? Callaway, Cross, and Drummond. They'll be moved to federal custody pending trial. The local charges will wait until after the federal case is resolved. Tanner sat heavily in his chair. Probably better that way. Less chance of interference or intimidation. Maria nodded, but her expression suggested she was thinking about something else. What happens to the cooperative? All the property Callaway seized, all the assets. That's complicated. Some of it was acquired legally, even if the methods were questionable. That'll have to be sorted out in court. But the properties that were taken through fraud, those should revert to the original owners once the cases are adjudicated. How long will that take? Tanner shrugged. Months, maybe years. The legal system moves slow even when it's trying to fix things. The frustration on Maria's face was clear. She'd spent 18 months documenting crimes, watching families suffer, knowing the truth but unable to force anyone to act on it. Now that action was finally happening, it would still take years to undo the damage. "It's not fair," she said quietly. "No, it's not." Tanner looked at his coffee like it might have answers. "But it's better than nothing, and nothing is what we had last week." From his cell, Callaway spoke for the first time. "This self-righteousness is touching, Roy, but you seem to be forgetting something. You were complicit in everything I did, every document you ignored, every complaint you buried, every investigation you sabotaged. You think testifying against me will save you? You're going down too." Tanner stood slowly and walked to the cell. "Maybe I am. Probably deserve to, but at least I'll go down trying to fix what I helped break." "What will you go down as, Marcus? A small-time criminal who thought he was smarter than everyone else?" Callaway's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, the door burst open and Thomas Holt rushed in, breathing hard. "They're coming," Holt said urgently. "Callaway's men, maybe 20 of them. I saw them gathering at the lumber mill." Tanner's stomach dropped. "When?" "Now. Soon. I rode hard to get here first." Holt looked at Maria, then at Tanner. "They're armed and they're angry. Someone told them Callaway's being transferred to Denver, and they want to break him out before that happens." Maria moved quickly to the window, looking out at Main Street. "Where's the stranger?" Don't know. Haven't seen him since last night. Tanner grabbed his rifle from the rack, checked the ammunition. His hands were shaking slightly. 20 armed men against one sheriff, a journalist, and an accountant. The mathematics were not favorable. We need to bar the door, Tanner said. Reinforce the windows. Make them work for it. And then what? Holt asked. We can't hold out against that many. Eventually they'll get in. Then we hold out long enough for help to arrive. What help? You deputized 3 men last night, and they're farmers who've never fired a shot in anger. This town doesn't have the resources to fight off 20 determined men. Tanner knew Holt was right, but he also knew they didn't have a choice. So we improvise. Maria, can you get to the telegraph office? Send for federal marshals, state militia, anyone? She was already moving toward the door. I'll try, but it'll take hours for anyone to get here, even if they respond immediately. Better than nothing. Tanner started pushing his desk toward the door. Thomas, help me barricade this. We buy whatever time we can. They worked quickly, stacking furniture against the door, boarding up the 2 street-facing windows with spare planks Tanner kept in the back room. It wasn't much, but it would slow an assault. From his cell, Callaway watched with something like satisfaction. You're going to get yourselves killed for nothing. Those men are loyal to me. They know which side their bread is buttered on. Loyal, Tanner said, hammering a board into place. That's a generous word for scared. They're not fighting for you, Marcus. They're fighting because they're afraid of what happens if you go down. Afraid all their crimes come to light. Afraid they'll be next. Fear is loyalty in another form. No, it's not. Tanner finished securing the window and moved to the second one. Loyalty is what makes a man stand beside you when times are hard. Fear is what makes him run the moment the threat is gone. You'll learn the difference soon enough. Outside, the sound of horses approaching. Multiple riders, moving with purpose. Tanner peered through a gap in the boards and counted heads. 15 men, maybe 16. Not 20 like Holt had said, but more than enough. They spread out in a loose semicircle around the jail, staying mounted, weapons visible but not yet drawn. Tanner recognized most of them. Mill workers, ranch hands, men who'd been on Callaway's payroll for months or years. Hard men who'd done hard things and weren't ready to face the consequences. One rider moved forward. Pete Logan, the ex-soldier who'd shown sense on that mountain road. He looked uncomfortable but determined. Sheriff Tanner, Pete called out. We need to talk. Tanner cracked the door slightly, rifle visible in his hands. Nothing to talk about, Pete. These men are in federal custody. They're not going anywhere except Denver. We can't let that happen. Can or won't. Pete shifted in his saddle. If Callaway goes to trial, he'll name names. Everyone who worked for him, everyone who followed orders. We'll all hang. So your plan is to break him out. Then what? Run, hide? You think that works better than facing justice? Justice. Pete laughed bitterly. We both know there's no justice for men like us. Just rope or prison. This way, at least we've got a chance. A chance at what? Becoming fugitives? Spending the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders? Tanner shook his head. There's another way, Pete. Cooperate. Testify. Show the court you're willing to make things right. Maybe that counts for something. Or maybe it counts for nothing and we hang anyway. Pete glanced back at the other riders. We're coming in, Sheriff. You can make this easy or hard, but we're coming in. Then you'll have to come through me. Pete looked genuinely regretful. Don't make us do this. Tanner closed the door, barred it, and positioned himself behind the desk barricade with his rifle aimed at the entrance. His heart was hammering, his mouth dry. He wasn't a brave man. He'd proven that over 2 years of cowardice and compromise. But maybe he could be brave for the next few minutes. Maybe that would be enough. The first gunshot shattered the morning quiet. It wasn't aimed at anyone, just a warning shot into the air. But it signaled the beginning. More shots followed, punching through the boarded windows, splintering wood. Tanner ducked instinctively, then forced himself to return fire through the gap in the door. He wasn't trying to hit anyone, just make them pay a price for getting too close. From the cells, Holt had thrown himself on the floor. Jake Drummond was pressed against the back wall, looking terrified. Callaway and Cross remained seated on their cots, watching the chaos with different expressions. Callaway eager and calculating, Cross merely observant. The assault continued for several minutes. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the jail. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. Tanner fired methodically, rationing his ammunition, trying to make each shot count. Then suddenly, the gunfire stopped. Tanner risked a look through the boards. The riders had pulled back, regrouping about 50 yards away. They were arguing about something, gesturing toward the jail, clearly uncertain about their next move. Then one of them pointed down Main Street. Tanner followed the gesture and felt something loosen in his chest. The stranger was walking up the middle of the street, alone and unhurried, like he was taking a morning stroll. He had no visible weapons, no backup, no plan that Tanner could discern. He just walked with that same calm certainty he'd shown on the mountain, the same presence that made you believe he knew exactly what was going to happen next. Pete Logan rode out to meet him, stopping his horse about 20 feet away. "You should turn around. This doesn't concern you." "Sure it does." The stranger stopped walking. "I went through considerable effort to put those men in that jail. I'd hate to see all that work undone by a prison break." "There's 15 of us. You're alone." 16, the stranger corrected. "I count 16, including the 2 in the back pretending to cover the alley." He gestured casually. "And you're right, I am alone. But that didn't work out so well for you boys last time." Pete's jaw tightened. "This is different. This time we're not giving up our weapons. This time we're ready." "Ready for what? To kill a lawman? To shoot up a town? To become exactly the kind of criminals you're so afraid of being called?" The stranger took a step forward. "You boys are scared. I understand that. Callaway kept you in line with fear, and now that fear's got nowhere to go except sideways. But this right here, this is where you make a choice that defines the rest of your lives. Easy for you to say. You're not facing a rope. You're not either. Not yet. But break into that jail, hurt the sheriff, free Callaway, and then you are. Then there's no going back, no cooperation, no reduced sentences. Just manhunts and wanted posters and running until you're caught." The stranger looked at each of the riders in turn. "Is that really what you want?" The silence stretched. Tanner watched from the jail, barely breathing, wondering if words alone could defuse 16 armed men. One of the riders, a younger man Tanner didn't recognize, lowered his rifle. "I'm out. I signed up for mill work, not this." He turned his horse and rode away. Then another left, and another. Pete watched his force crumble, his expression pained. "Stop. All of you, stop. We're in this together." "No," said one of the departing riders. "We were in it together when it was just work. This here is something else." Within 5 minutes, only 6 riders remained. Pete looked at them, looked at the stranger, looked at the jail where Tanner was watching through the boards. "This isn't over," Pete said. "Yeah, it is." The stranger's voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. "You just don't want to admit it yet. But it's over, Pete. Callaway's done. The cooperative's done. The only question now is whether you go down with them or step away while you still can." Pete's hands tightened on his reins. For a long moment, Tanner thought the man might actually draw, might actually try to fight. But then his shoulders sagged and he shook his head. "You boys do what you want," Pete said to the remaining riders. "I'm done." He turned his horse and rode away. The others followed, leaving the street empty except for the stranger. Tanner opened the door of the jail, stepped out into the morning sunlight. His legs felt weak, adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "You cut that pretty close," Tanner said. "I was watching from the hotel. Waited to see if you'd handle it yourself." The stranger looked at the damaged jail, the bullet holes, the shattered windows. "You did good. Held them off until they started questioning whether it was worth it. I was about to run out of ammunition. But you didn't. You stood." The stranger met his eyes. "That counts." Maria Reyes came running from the telegraph office, out of breath. "Federal marshals are coming. They'll be here by evening. I also sent word to the newspaper in Denver. Let them know what's happening here. Should be front page tomorrow." "Good." The stranger looked back toward the north end of town, where the riders had disappeared. "Those men will scatter. Some will run. Some will try to disappear into regular life. Most won't cause any more trouble. And if they do, then they'll be dealt with. But I think the fight's out of them." He turned to Tanner. "You should prepare for the transfer. Federal marshals will want everything documented, all the evidence organized, statements ready." Tanner nodded. "What about you?" "I'll stay until the marshals arrive. Make sure nothing else develops." The stranger started walking back toward the boarding house. "After that, I've got no more reason to be here. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Maria worked with Tanner to organize every piece of documentation, property records, financial ledgers, witness statements, everything that would support the federal case against Callaway. Thomas Holt came to the jail to give a formal statement, his hands still shaking but his voice steady. "I enabled him," Holt said, sitting across from Tanner in the office. "I knew what was happening. I processed the fraudulent loans, I forged signatures when he asked. I manipulated the books to hide what we were doing. I'm as guilty as he is." "You also helped stop him," Tanner pointed out. "You gave Maria access to the records, you testified, you stood up when it mattered." After 2 years of standing down, Holt's voice was bitter. "That doesn't balance the scales." "Maybe not, but it's something." Tanner leaned back in his chair. "The prosecutors will decide what charges you face, what sentence you deserve. But I'll make sure they know you cooperated, that you tried to make it right." "Will that matter?" "I don't know. I hope so." Tanner looked at the cells where Callaway and the others sat. "We all have to hope there's some room for redemption in this world. Otherwise, what's the point of trying to be better?" By late afternoon, word had spread throughout Silver Ridge about the failed prison break. People emerged from their homes cautiously, like animals checking if the predator had truly left. They gathered in small groups on street corners, talking in low voices, trying to process what had happened. The Morrison family, who'd lost their ancestral land to Callaway's fraudulent foreclosure, stood outside the jail for an hour, just staring at the building. Mrs. Morrison wept quietly while her husband held her, neither of them quite believing that justice might actually be coming. George Potter closed his hardware store and went to visit his cousin, the one who'd lost the ranch, to tell him that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be made right. Families who'd been crushed under debt they didn't owe started asking questions about how to file claims, how to seek restitution, how to rebuild lives that had been systematically destroyed. The town was beginning to heal, but it was the painful kind of healing that required acknowledging the wound first. As the sun started setting, a contingent of 4 federal marshals rode into Silver Ridge, led by a stern woman in her 40s named Marshal Catherine Brennan. She took one look at the bullet-riddled jail and raised an eyebrow. "Eventful day, Sheriff Tanner?" "You could say that." Tanner handed her the compiled documentation. "Everything you need is here. Financial crimes, fraud, extortion, conspiracy. We've got witness testimony, physical evidence, and 3 suspects in custody." Brennan flipped through the documents, her expression hardening as she read. "This is extensive. How long has this been going on?" 2 years of active operation, probably longer in the planning stages. "And you're only now bringing charges because—" Tanner met her gaze steadily. "Because I was on Callaway's payroll and didn't have the spine to stand up to him. That's the truth, Marshal. I'll face whatever consequences come from that." Brennan studied him for a long moment. "We'll discuss your involvement later. For now, I need to secure the prisoners and begin the transfer process." The marshals worked efficiently, moving Callaway, Cross, and Jake Drummond from the local jail cells to a reinforced wagon designed for prisoner transport. Callaway maintained his dignity throughout, refusing to show fear or regret. Cross remained silent and composed. Jake looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. As they were being loaded into the wagon, Callaway caught sight of the stranger standing in the shadows across the street. "You," Callaway said. "I still don't even know your name." The stranger didn't respond. "All this, the careful planning, the timing, the precision, this was personal for you." "It had to be." Callaway leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow. "What did I ever do to you?" "Nothing," the stranger said. "Never met you before I came to Silver Ridge, Then why?" The stranger considered the question. "Because someone needed to, and I happened to be available." Callaway laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "You destroyed my empire because you happened to be available? That's insane." "Maybe, but your empire's still destroyed, so I guess it worked out." The marshal closed the wagon door, cutting off any further conversation. Within minutes, the transport was rolling north toward Denver, carrying 3 prisoners who would face federal justice. Maria stood beside Tanner, watching the wagon disappear into the gathering darkness. "It's really over." "The arrest part is. The legal part's just starting." Tanner looked exhausted. I'll probably lose my badge, might face charges myself for corruption and obstruction. Probably, Maria agreed. But you did the right thing in the end. That should count for something. Should, doesn't always. He turned to her. What about you? What's next? I'm writing the story. Full exposé for the Denver Post. Every detail of how Callaway operated, how he corrupted local officials, how he destroyed families. And then, she paused. Then, I don't know. Maybe stay in Silver Ridge, help rebuild, maybe move on to the next story. You'd be welcome to stay. Town could use someone with your integrity. Maria smiled. We'll see. They stood together in the quiet evening, watching the empty street where so much violence and fear had played out over the past few days. Silver Ridge felt different now, lighter somehow, like a pressure that had been building for years had finally been released. The stranger approached them, his saddlebags packed, his horse ready. I'll be leaving in the morning. So soon? Maria asked. No reason to stay longer. The marshals have it from here, and you folks can handle the rest. He looked at Tanner. You'll do fine, Sheriff. Just keep making the hard choices. That's advice from a man who makes them look easy. They're never easy. You just do them anyway. The stranger tipped his hat. Good luck to both of you. He walked toward the boarding house, leaving Tanner and Maria standing in the street. That night, Mrs. Gaines prepared a special dinner. Roast chicken, vegetables from her winter stores, fresh bread. She insisted the stranger join her in the dining room rather than eating alone in his room. You saved this town, she said, serving him generous portions. I know you don't like hearing it, but it's true. I gave it a chance to save itself. There's a difference. If you say so. She sat across from him. Where will you go next? North, I think. Heard about some trouble in Montana, mining town where the company's squeezing workers. Might see if I can help. And after that? After that, somewhere else. He ate slowly, savoring the food. There's always somewhere else. Mrs. Gaines was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table and placed her hand on his. Thank you for everything you did, for caring about people you didn't know. The stranger looked uncomfortable with the gratitude but didn't pull his hand away. Just trying to balance some old debts. I think you've balanced them 10 times over. I'll let you know when I feel caught up. They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Afterward, the stranger went upstairs and stood by his window, looking out at Silver Ridge one last time. Lights glowed in windows across town. Families were together, safe, no longer living in fear. It wasn't perfect. It would take years to fully recover from Callaway's damage, but it was better. That was all he ever aimed for. Better. Not fixed, not saved, just better than it was. He pulled the curtains closed and went to bed. Morning came cold and clear. The stranger settled his bill with Mrs. Gaines, who refused to accept full payment and eventually compromised on half. He loaded his saddlebags, checked his weapons, and led his horse out into the dawn light. A few people were already on the street, shopkeepers opening early, workers heading to the mill, farmers bringing goods to sell. Most didn't know who he was or what he'd done. The ones who did nodded respectfully as he passed. Maria caught up with him at the edge of town. Leaving without saying goodbye? Goodbyes are difficult for me. I noticed. She handed him a folded newspaper. First edition with the story. Thought you might want a copy. He took it, glanced at the headline. Federal marshals arrest corrupt businessman in Silver Ridge. Years of fraud exposed. Below that, in smaller text, anonymous gunslinger aids local authorities. Anonymous, he noted. I kept your name out of it like you asked. Referred to you as a concerned citizen who wished to remain unidentified. She smiled. Though between you and me, half the town knows exactly who you are. They'll forget soon enough. People do. Maybe. Or maybe some stories stick. Maria looked at him seriously. Thank you for everything. You did the real work, the investigation, the documentation, the courage to stand up publicly. I just provided some tactical support. Tactical support that saved lives and caught criminals. She extended her hand. If you're ever back this way, you've got friends here. He shook her hand. I'll remember that. He mounted his horse and rode north out of Silver Ridge, following the same road that had brought him here 3 weeks ago. The morning sun painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink, and the air was crisp and clean. Behind him, Silver Ridge began its long process of recovery. Sheriff Tanner would face an inquiry into his conduct and would ultimately lose his badge, but avoid criminal charges in exchange for his testimony. He'd spend the next year working odd jobs and trying to rebuild his reputation, eventually becoming a deputy in a neighboring county where people gave him a second chance. Thomas Holt would testify extensively at Callaway's trial, providing detailed accounts of the fraudulent schemes. His cooperation would earn him probation instead of prison time, and he'd spend his remaining years running his small ranch and trying to make peace with his conscience. Maria Reyes would write a series of articles exposing corruption throughout Colorado, eventually taking a position with a major Denver newspaper. Her work on the Callaway case would win awards and establish her as one of the most respected investigative journalists in the region. The Morrison family and dozens of others would eventually reclaim their properties after lengthy legal battles. The cooperative would be dissolved, its assets distributed to creditors and victims. Some of the damage would be repaired, though some scars would remain forever. Marcus Callaway would be convicted on 17 counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. He'd spend 20 years in federal prison, maintaining his innocence throughout and dying bitter and alone, convinced the world had wronged him rather than the other way around. Vincent Cross would receive a lighter sentence in exchange for testimony and would disappear into obscurity after his release. Jake Drummond would serve 8 years, get out on good behavior, and would spend the rest of his life working in lumber mills and trying to forget he'd ever been anything else. Pete Logan and several others who'd worked for Callaway would scatter across the Western Territories. Some would be caught and face justice. Others would start new lives under new names. All of them would carry the weight of what they'd done. But the stranger knew none of this as he rode away. He never stayed long enough to see the full consequences of his actions. He just moved pieces into position, created possibilities, and trusted that good people would do good things once the obstacles were removed. The road ahead was long and empty. He had supplies for 2 weeks, enough money for a month if he was careful, and the name of a mining town in Montana where justice needed help. It was enough. It was always enough. He rode through the mountain pass where he'd stopped Callaway's wagon, past the surveyor's office where this had all started, and into the wilderness beyond. The horse moved steadily beneath him, unbothered by the cold or the altitude or the uncertain destination. By midday, Silver Ridge was out of sight behind him, lost among the mountains and valleys of Colorado. The stranger didn't look back. He never did. Ahead, somewhere in the vast landscape, was another town that needed help, another corrupt official who needed stopping, another chance to balance old debts and maybe, just maybe, make the world a fraction better than it had been before he arrived. He urged his horse forward and disappeared into the endless country, already becoming a story that people would tell in Silver Ridge for years to come. The mysterious gunslinger who'd saved their town and vanished before anyone could thank him properly. But stories didn't matter to him. Results did. And in Silver Ridge, for the first time in years, people could sleep without fear, could plan futures without wondering if those futures would be stolen, could trust that tomorrow might actually be better than today. That was the result that mattered. That was enough. 3 months after the stranger left Silver Ridge, spring arrived in the mountains with the kind of reluctant warmth that suggested winter might come back at any moment. Snow melted in uneven patches, revealing brown grass and mud that turned Main Street into a sticky mess. But people walked through it with something close to optimism, which was more than could be said for the previous 2 springs. Maria Reyes stood in the office of what had once been the Silver Ridge Herald, looking at the dust-covered printing press and wondering if she was making a mistake. The newspaper had folded 8 months ago when the owner couldn't afford to keep running stories that upset Marcus Callaway. Now the building sat empty, equipment included, available for purchase at a price that seemed almost insulting. "It's not much," said Walter Kim, the banker who was handling the estate sale. He was a nervous man in his 50s who'd spent 2 years processing Callaway's fraudulent loans and was now trying very hard to be helpful to everyone. "The press needs work, the typesets are incomplete, and the roof leaks in 3 places." "I can see that." Maria ran her hand along the press frame, feeling the cold metal. "What are you asking for it?" Kim named a figure that was indeed insulting, insultingly low. "The estate just wants it gone. No one else has shown interest." "I'll take it." Kim blinked. "Just like that? Don't you want to think about it? Maybe bring someone to assess the equipment?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 months, and I know enough about printing to see what works and what doesn't." She looked around the dusty office, already imagining it cleaned up, functional, alive again. "This town needs a newspaper. Someone has to tell the truth about what's happening here. The Denver Post already published your expose. That was about what happened. This is about what happens next. Maria pulled out a checkbook, recently acquired thanks to the payment she'd received for the Callaway articles. Who do I make this out to? Within a week, Maria had hired 2 assistants, both young women from town who'd lost family members to Callaway's schemes and wanted to do something productive with their anger. They cleaned the office, repaired the press, organized the typesets, and put together the first edition of the revived Silver Ridge Herald. The headline read, "Cooperative assets to be distributed. Families may reclaim lost property." Below that, Maria had written a detailed explanation of the legal process, listing which properties were being returned, which cases were still pending, and how victims could file claims. She'd spent weeks researching the procedures, interviewing lawyers, making sure every piece of information was accurate. The first edition sold out in 4 hours. People bought copies and read them on street corners, in general stores, in their homes over dinner. For the first time in years, they had information they could trust, news that wasn't filtered through Callaway's influence. Sheriff Roy Tanner bought a copy and read it in his small room above the general store. He was no longer sheriff. That badge had been taken back during the inquiry, exactly as he'd expected. But he testified honestly at Callaway's preliminary hearings, admitted his own corruption, and somehow that honesty had earned him something like grudging respect from people who'd once despised him. The new sheriff, a competent woman named Sarah Chen, who'd transferred from Denver, had offered him a job as deputy. He'd turned it down initially, feeling he didn't deserve the chance, but she'd insisted, and eventually he'd accepted, figuring he could do more good working than wallowing. He folded the newspaper and walked down to the jail, where Chen was reviewing case files from the Callaway era. "You see Maria's article?" Tanner asked. "Read it twice." Chen looked up, exhausted. "She's doing good work, making all this legal confusion actually understandable. She's making us look bad by comparison. We are bad by comparison. She's a journalist who risked her life to expose corruption. We're law enforcement who let it happen." Chen rubbed her eyes. "But we're trying to be better. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Chen considered the question. "I think so. Not enough to erase what happened, but enough to maybe build something different going forward." Tanner wanted to believe that. Some days he did. Other days he just felt the weight of all the complaints he'd buried, all the victims he'd ignored, all the times he'd chosen comfort over courage. The door opened and Thomas Holt entered, looking nervous. He was always nervous now, even though the legal proceedings against him had concluded with probation and community service. The guilt ate at him constantly. "Sheriff Chen, I wanted to report something," Holt said. "What is it?" "I saw Pete Logan this morning. He's back in town." That got both their attention. Pete had disappeared after the failed prison break, supposedly heading to Wyoming or Montana. His return was unexpected and potentially problematic. "Where did you see him?" Chen asked. "At the Morrison Ranch. He was talking to Mr. Morrison, looked like they were working together on something." Chen and Tanner exchanged glances. "Working on what?" "I don't know. I was just passing by on the road." Holt shifted uncomfortably. "Should I have stopped? Ask questions?" "No, you did right coming here." Chen stood, reached for her coat. "Roy, come with me. Let's see what this is about." They rode out to the Morrison property, where they found Pete Logan helping John Morrison repair a fence line. Both men looked up as the sheriff and deputy approached, but neither looked guilty or worried. "Sheriff?" Morrison said, setting down his hammer. "Something we can help you with?" "Got a report that Pete Logan was back in town. Wanted to check on the situation." Chen's tone was careful, not accusatory, but not friendly either. Pete straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I came back 2 days ago. Figured I'd turn myself in, face whatever charges are coming. But Mr. Morrison here offered me work for a few days before I do." Morrison nodded. "Pete came to my door, apologized for everything he'd done working for Callaway. Said he knew sorry wasn't enough, but wanted to make some kind of restitution. So I'm having him help fix all the damage that happened to this property when Callaway's men ran me off." Chen studied both men, trying to gauge sincerity. "Pete, you know you're wanted for questioning regarding the attempted prison break." "Yes, ma'am. I'll come in whenever you want. I just wanted to do something useful first, something that actually helps instead of hurts." "And after that? After you face whatever legal consequences come?" Pete looked at the fence, the land, the mountains beyond. I was thinking I might ask if Mr. Morrison needs permanent help, ranch work, honest work, if he'll have me. Morrison's expression softened slightly. We'll see how the next few days go, but I'm willing to consider it. Chen thought about all the ways this could be a trick, a manipulation, an attempt to avoid justice. But she also thought about what rehabilitation meant, about whether people could actually change, about the difference between punishment and restoration. Finish the fence, she said finally. Then come see me tomorrow morning. We'll sort out the legal situation. Yes, ma'am. As they rode back to town, Tanner said quietly, You think he means it? The apology, the wanting to make things right? I think he's scared and guilty and looking for a way to live with what he's done, Chen replied. Whether that's genuine change or just self-interest dressed up as redemption, I don't know. But Morrison's willing to give him a chance, and that's Morrison's choice to make. And if Pete hurts him, takes advantage, then we arrest him and he goes to prison. But I'd rather believe people can be better than they were. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Tanner didn't have an answer to that. He was still trying to figure out if he could be better than he'd been, and most days the evidence was mixed. Back in town, the rebuilding continued in small ways. George Potter's hardware store started stocking materials for all the repairs people were finally able to afford now that Callaway's crushing debt collection had stopped. The Morrison family wasn't the only one reclaiming property. 7 other families had gotten their land back through court orders, and 5 more cases were pending. But not everyone benefited. Some properties had been sold to third parties who'd purchased them in good faith, and untangling those transactions was proving nearly impossible. Some debts had been legitimate, even if the terms were harsh, and those couldn't just be erased. Some damage was permanent. The Hendricks family had lost their daughter to illness while they were fighting Callaway's foreclosure, too poor to afford proper medical care. Getting their farm back couldn't bring her home. The Zhao family's son had left town in shame after his father's business collapsed, and no one knew where he'd gone or if he'd ever return. Reversing the bankruptcy didn't heal that wound. Maria wrote about all of it, the successes and the failures, the justice and the lingering injustice. She didn't shy away from the complicated parts, didn't pretend everything was fixed just because Callaway was in prison. One afternoon she received a letter. The postmark said Montana, but there was no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a brief message in neat handwriting. Read your articles. Good work. Keep telling the truth, even when it's not the truth people want to hear, especially then. It was unsigned, but Maria knew who it was from. She smiled, folded the letter carefully, and put it in her desk drawer. The stranger was out there somewhere, doing whatever it was he did. Helping another town, fighting another corrupt official, standing in another road and saying, no further. She wondered if he ever stopped, ever rested, ever allowed himself to believe he'd done enough. Probably not. Men like that carried debts that couldn't be quantified, guilt that couldn't be measured. They just kept working, kept trying, kept moving because stopping meant confronting everything they couldn't fix. She understood that more than she liked to admit. Every night, she lay awake thinking about the families she'd documented but couldn't save, the evidence she'd found too late, the stories that ended badly despite her best efforts. The work was never finished. The truth was never complete. You just kept digging, kept writing, kept hoping that enough light would eventually make a difference. 2 weeks later, Thomas Holt showed up at the newspaper office with a ledger under his arm. I've been going through my old records, he said, setting the book on Maria's desk. Personal copies I kept of everything I processed for Callaway. I thought I'd destroyed them all, but I found this in my attic. Maria opened the ledger, scanning the entries. They were meticulous, dates, amounts, names, transaction details. Thomas, this is evidence. You should give this to Sheriff Chen. I did. She said to bring you a copy for your reporting. He sat down heavily. I want people to know exactly what happened. Every detail, every crime. I helped him do these things, and I need people to understand the full scope of it. This will make you look worse. You understand that? I know. Holt's voice was quiet. But it's the truth. And I've been hiding from the truth for too long. Maria studied him. The guilt was eating him alive, would probably keep eating him alive for the rest of his life. Confession wouldn't fix that. Nothing would. But maybe it would make the weight a little easier to carry. I'll write it accurately, she said. Won't spare you, won't spare anyone, but I'll be fair. That's all I'm asking. She spent the next 3 days going through the ledger, cross-referencing it with court documents and witness statements. What emerged was a complete picture of Callaway's operation. Not just the big crimes, but the small ones. The intimidation tactics, the legal manipulations, the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. The resulting article was 8,000 words long, far too much for a small-town newspaper. She published it in 3 parts over 3 weeks, each installment selling out immediately. People read it and got angry all over again. But it was a different kind of angry than before. Not hopeless and impotent, but focused and determined. Town council meetings became packed with citizens demanding accountability, transparency, reform. The mayor, who'd been Callaway's ally, resigned under pressure. A special election brought in someone new, someone who'd lost family property to the cooperative and had a personal stake in making sure it never happened again. The town council passed new ordinances requiring public disclosure of all property transactions, independent audits of major business deals, and community oversight of lending practices. They weren't perfect laws. Nothing was. But they were better than what had existed before. Sarah Chen hired 2 more deputies and established regular office hours where citizens could file complaints without fear of retaliation. She published a report on her department's activities every month, listing arrests, investigations, and outcomes. People started trusting law enforcement again, slowly and cautiously, but genuinely. By summer, Silver Ridge felt different. Not healed. It would take years, maybe generations, to fully heal. But changed. The fear that had hung over everything was gone. People walked straighter, spoke louder, looked each other in the eye. One evening, Maria sat on the porch of the newspaper office, watching the sun set over the mountains and thinking about everything that had happened. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find Roy Tanner standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want some company," he said. She gestured to the chair beside her. "Always." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the town settle into evening. Lights came on in windows. Families gathered for dinner. Children played in yards without supervision, which hadn't happened in 2 years. "Do you think it's permanent?" Tanner asked eventually. "The change?" "I don't know. Probably not completely. People forget. New corruption grows in different forms. It's never really over." Maria set down her coffee. "But I think we're better equipped to fight it now. More aware. More willing to stand up. Because of him. The stranger. Because of all of us. He started it, but we're the ones who finished it. We're the ones who have to keep it going." She looked at Tanner. "You included. You made bad choices, but you're making better ones now. That matters." Tanner wanted to believe her. "How do you know when you've done enough? When you've balanced the scales?" "I don't think you ever do. I think you just keep trying until you can't anymore." She smiled sadly. "Not a very satisfying answer, is it?" "No, but probably the honest one." They watched the sunset together until the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over Silver Ridge during its darkest days, and were still watching now during its uncertain recovery. Across town, Thomas Holt sat in his small ranch house, writing letters to families he'd wronged. Most wouldn't write back. Some would tear up the letters without reading them. But he wrote them anyway, because what else could he do? Pete Logan finished his fence work at the Morrison Ranch and went to the sheriff's office the next morning as promised. He pled guilty to conspiracy charges, served 4 months in jail, and came out to find John Morrison still willing to hire him. He'd worked that ranch for the next 20 years, never quite forgiving himself, but slowly learning to live with what he'd done. Jake Drummond, in federal prison, wrote no letters and made no apologies. He served his time in bitter silence, convinced he'd been unfairly targeted, that everyone else was just as guilty. When he got out, he drifted from town to town, working mill jobs and blaming the world for his problems. Some people never changed. That was just how it was. Vincent Cross, released after 6 years on good behavior, disappeared completely. Some said he went to San Francisco. Others claimed he'd gone east to New York. No one in Silver Ridge ever heard from him again. He was smart enough to know that redemption wasn't available to everyone, that sometimes the best you could do was minimize future damage. Marcus Callaway spent his prison years filing appeals, writing bitter letters to newspapers about judicial overreach, and maintaining that he'd been a legitimate businessman persecuted by jealous competitors and corrupt officials. He died in prison after 16 years, alone and unrepentant. His obituary in the Denver Post was 3 paragraphs long and notable mainly for what it didn't say. Nothing about family, nothing about legacy, nothing about anyone mourning his passing. The cooperative's assets were eventually distributed, though the process took 3 years and satisfied no one completely. Some families got their property back. Others got financial settlements that didn't come close to covering their losses. Still others got nothing but an acknowledgement that they'd been wronged, which helped exactly as much as you'd expect. But Silver Ridge survived. More than survived. It grew. The population increased as word spread that the town was under new management, so to speak. New businesses opened, the school expanded, people invested in futures they actually believed they'd get to live. 5 years after Callaway's arrest, Maria sat in the newspaper office, now properly repaired with a working roof and functional heating, and looked at her latest editorial. It was about municipal water rights, dry and technical, the kind of story most people would skip over. But it was important. It was local government making decisions that affected real people. And someone needed to watch, needed to document, needed to make sure the mistakes of the past didn't repeat themselves. She heard footsteps outside and looked up to see Sheriff Sarah Chen entering with a stranger, a young woman in her 20s with determined eyes and a notebook under her arm. "Maria, this is Jennifer Ortiz," Chen said. "She's a journalism student from Denver doing research on civic recovery after corruption. I told her she should talk to you." Maria stood, shook the young woman's hand. "Research project?" "Doctoral thesis," Jennifer said. "I'm studying how communities rebuild after systemic corruption is exposed." Silver Ridge came up repeatedly in my research as a case study. Case study in what? Success? Failure? Both, honestly. The corruption was exposed and prosecuted, which is success, but the recovery has been slow and incomplete, which is failure. Jennifer pulled out her notebook. "I'm trying to understand what factors make the difference, why some towns bounce back and others don't." Maria gestured to a chair. "I'll tell you what I can, but I'm not sure I have any universal answers." They talked for 2 hours. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions about the investigation, the legal proceedings, the community response. She asked about the stranger, and Maria told what little she knew, that he'd appeared when needed, done what was necessary, and left before anyone could thank him properly. "Does it bother you?" Jennifer asked. "That he got no credit? That most people outside Silver Ridge don't even know he existed?" Maria thought about the letter she'd received from Montana 5 years ago. "I think he preferred it that way. Recognition wasn't what he was looking for." Then what was he looking for? "I'm not sure he knew. Justice, maybe? Or just the satisfaction of standing in the way of powerful men who thought they could do whatever they wanted." Maria leaned back in her chair. "Some people carry weights we can't see. They spend their lives trying to balance scales that might not be balanceable. You can't fix those people, can't save them. You can only be grateful when they show up." Jennifer wrote that down carefully. "Do you think he's still out there, still doing this? Probably. Or he's dead. Men who live that way don't usually get peaceful endings." Maria felt a pang of sadness at the thought. "But I hope he's alive. I hope he's helping another town, fighting another corrupt official, making another impossible thing happen." "Do you think he'll ever come back here?" "No reason to. The work's done. We're handling the rest ourselves." Maria smiled, which I think is exactly what he wanted. Jennifer finished her interview and left with promises to send Maria a copy of her thesis when it was completed. Sheriff Chen lingered behind, looking thoughtful. "You really think he's still out there?" Chen asked. "I'd like to think so." "And if he came back? If there was another problem that needed someone like him?" Maria considered the question. "I think we'd handle it ourselves. That's what he taught us, that we're capable of standing up, of fighting back, of not accepting corruption as inevitable. We don't need a mysterious stranger to save us. We just needed someone to show us we could save ourselves." Chen nodded slowly. "That's a better legacy than most people leave." "It is." After Chen left, Maria turned back to her editorial about water rights. Boring, technical, important, the kind of work that kept towns functioning, that prevented small problems from becoming big ones, that made sure the people in charge knew someone was watching. It wasn't dramatic. It wouldn't make headlines in Denver, but it mattered. She'd learned that from a man who'd sat on office steps waiting for armed men, who'd stood in mountain roads blocking wagons, who'd made impossible shots and calculated perfect angles. Not because he wanted glory, but because someone needed to and he happened to be there. That was the real lesson of Silver Ridge. Not that heroes would save you, but that you could save yourself if you were willing to stand up, speak out, and refuse to accept that corruption was just how things worked. The stranger had given them that. Not directly, but by example. By showing that one person who refused to back down could change everything. Maria finished her editorial as the sun set outside. She'd publish it tomorrow, and most people would skip it in favor of the stories about the church social or the high school baseball team. But a few would read it. A few would pay attention. A few would understand that vigilance was the price of freedom, and that price was worth paying. She locked up the office and walked home through the quiet streets of Silver Ridge, past families in their homes, past businesses closing for the night, past the jail where Sarah Chen was finishing paperwork under lamplight. The town wasn't perfect. It still had problems, poverty, disagreements, occasional crimes, but the systemic rot was gone, cut out by sharp knives wielded by people who'd finally found the courage to hold them. And somewhere out there, on some other mountain road, in some other town that needed help, maybe a stranger was sitting on steps waiting for armed men who didn't know they were about to learn a hard lesson. Or maybe he was dead, killed in a fight that hadn't gone his way, buried in an unmarked grave in some nowhere place. Either way, his work in Silver Ridge was finished. The town he'd helped save would have to save itself from here on out. And maybe, just maybe, that was always the point.